Sworn deposition of Pavel Dmitrievich Orlov, topographical engineer, third grade filed before the Imperial Russian Geographical Society, Administrative Committee for Northern Survey Operations, St. Petersburg, 14 March 1898. Transcribed by Clerk M. Fedorov. Present in full session, witnessed by Chairman Anatoly Bergman and Committee Secretary Ivan Lashkov. The deponent was informed of the nature of the proceeding, the requirement of truthful testimony, and the Society's authority to receive and record the account for administrative disposition. The deponent was further informed that the record may be held under seal at the committee's discretion. The deponent stated that he understood. The deponent then requested that the committee allow him to proceed without interruption until he signaled that he had reached the point in the account requiring direct question. The committee agreed. The following is the deponent's account, rendered in the first person and transcribed as spoken. I will begin by telling the committee what I am not going to say. I am not going to say that I am uncertain about what I saw. I am not going to say that the cold affected my judgment, or that the darkness was responsible for misinterpretation, or that the stress of a forced weather hold on an exposed shelf at 74 degrees north latitude produced in me or my men a shared episode of perceptual failure. I have considered all of those explanations in the months since my return. I considered them during the descent, and I considered them on the return transit, and I considered them through the winter. I am a trained topographical engineer. I have been conducting northern surveys for the Imperial Russian Geographical Society for 11 years. I know what I saw. What I do not know, and what I will not pretend to know, is what it was. That is the limit of my uncertainty, and I want the committee to understand the distinction before I proceed. The survey party assembled in Arkhangelsk on the 22nd of August, 1897. We were contracted to complete the northern boundary triangulation of the Novaya Zemlya archipelago, specifically the upper coastal shelf between Matochkin Shar and the Northern Cape, a survey that had been partially completed in 1891 and was considered administratively incomplete due to instrument failure on that prior expedition. The Society wanted the work finished. The window for fieldwork above the 72nd parallel closes early, and I had advised in correspondence that the August assembly date left insufficient margin for autumn storms. The committee at that time judged the margin acceptable. I record this not as complaint, but as context. We were, from the first day of the field phase, working against a deteriorating season. There were 7 of us in the active survey party, not counting the ship's crew that put us ashore and returned to collect us on the agreed date. I should account for each man, because the committee will need to understand who made which decisions and why. I am Pavel Orlov. I was 41 years old in August of 1897. I have previously submitted to this committee my survey credentials, my prior expedition record covering the Pechora Basin work of 1889 and the Ob River triangulation of 1893, and my current standing with the Society. I will not repeat that material here. I will say only that I have spent approximately 900 days in the field over my career, of which roughly 260 have been in conditions classified as Arctic or subarctic by the Society's own definitions. I know what cold does to men. I know what isolation does to them. I know the difference between a mind producing what it fears and a mind recording what it finds. My second was Grigory Sokolov, age 47, an instrument specialist with whom I had worked on the Ob River survey 4 years prior. Sokolov was a methodical man, deliberate, not quick to speak, and not quick to alarm. He smoked a short-stemmed pipe, even in temperatures that made the tobacco burn badly, and he had a habit of tapping the bowl against his knee when he was thinking. I trusted his observations completely. He had a bad left knee from an old coastal work injury, and he climbed with a slight forward lean that made him slower on ascent than the others, but steadier on ice. Pyotr Chesov was our senior field assistant, 29 years old. He had been with me only on the preliminary groundwork for this expedition, which had involved 2 weeks of coastal survey from ship during the previous summer, nothing demanding. He was physically very capable, strong across the shoulders, good with the sledges, and he had a practical intelligence that I valued in camp management. He was also, I should say directly, a man whose nerve I had not yet tested in genuine difficulty. I would learn more about that nerve in the days the committee is asking me to describe. Dmitri Halvorsen was our second field assistant, age 33. His mother had been Norwegian, and he had spent several seasons in his 20s working cargo transits in the Barents, which gave him a useful and unsentimental familiarity with northern sea approaches. He spoke little, ate efficiently, and had a quality I have observed in men who have spent time in genuinely dangerous environments, which is that he was watchful in a practiced way, rather than an anxious one. He scanned terrain without appearing to do so. I noticed it when we first made landfall, and I noted it as an asset. The fifth man was our cook and general logistics support, Semyon Radko, age 52. He had no formal expedition credentials. He had been recommended by the Society's supply contractor as a man experienced in field cooking under northern conditions, and this recommendation proved accurate. He was not a man who engaged much with the survey work itself, but he maintained our caloric intake with competence, and he was reliable in his routines in a way that I came to understand mattered considerably to the rest of the men. When Radko had a fire going and something hot in the pot, things felt controllable. When Radko was rattled, the men felt it immediately. The sixth member of the party was our physician, Dr. Nikolai Brenner, age 38. He had been assigned by the Society at my request, following a cold injury incident on the 1891 expedition. He was a civilian doctor from Irkutsk with experience in frostbite management and cold injury triage, a calm man, academically inclined, who kept a personal journal throughout the expedition, and whom I believe submitted a separate account to the Society's medical registry. The committee should consult that record, if it has not already done so. Brenner saw everything I saw. His account, if he gave one, will corroborate mine in every material particular. The seventh man was Alexei Voss. I will speak about Voss at length before this deposition is finished, and the committee will understand why I have found it difficult to do so. For now I will establish only this. Voss was 24 years old. He was a junior cartographer, recently certified by the Society, and this was his first major field assignment in Arctic conditions. He was not inexperienced in map work. His chart drafting was excellent. His instrument readings were precise, and in the first weeks of the survey he performed his functions with a thoroughness that I noted in my field log. He was earnest. He was serious about his work in the way that young men are serious about the first important thing they have ever done. He had written to the Society the previous spring, requesting a northern assignment specifically, and he had been granted one. He had told me, in the course of a camp conversation early in the expedition, that he believed the great remaining work of geography was documentation, that the world was not yet fully known, and that the men who completed the knowledge of it were doing something permanent, something that outlasted them. I told him that I agreed with this in principle, and that it was also a philosophy best held with flexible hands, because the field had a way of rearranging priorities. He smiled at this and said that flexibility was exactly what a deposition from a Society expedition was meant to produce. He was young enough to think that sounded like wisdom. I am going to describe the survey conditions before I describe the events, because the committee needs to understand the physical situation clearly. The account will not make sense without that foundation, and I am not inclined to present something that does not make sense. We made landfall on the southern approach to the upper archipelago on the 1st of September. The ship's captain had concerns about the pack ice already forming in the northern approaches, and we had a discussion, which was heated on both sides, about the feasibility of reaching the target survey area before conditions precluded a safe return transit. He wanted to put us ashore at the lower position and have us work upward. I wanted the northern landfall first, because the upper triangulation points were the ones most critical to the contract, and I preferred to secure them before the season deteriorated further. We reached a compromise that satisfied neither of us, and that I mention only because it is the reason we were where we were when the weather closed. We landed at the northern approach position on the 4th of September. The sea was already difficult. The temperature on landfall was -6°C, with a northeast wind that made exposed skin painful within 3 minutes. The coastal shelf was snow-covered, and the rock beneath it was fractured basalt, poor footing, requiring careful movement with the sledges. We moved the equipment inland and upward over the first 3 days, establishing a base camp at approximately 340 meters elevation on a south-facing slope that offered partial shelter from the prevailing wind. From that base, we conducted our initial triangulation work across the upper shelf, which rose to approximately 460 meters and then leveled into a broad exposed plateau, treeless, and essentially featureless except for scattered rock cairns that appeared to be old navigation markers, though of what age or origin I could not determine. The survey work itself proceeded normally through the first 11 days. I will not describe it at length because it is not directly relevant to the events the committee is asking about. I will say that the triangulation was proceeding ahead of the original schedule, that the data we were accumulating was clean, and that I had some confidence we would complete the primary survey before the ship returned. The men were working well together. The cold was severe, but within the range of what we had prepared for. Nights were long and dark, and the temperature dropped reliably to between -15 and -20°C after midnight, which was uncomfortable but manageable with the tent equipment we carried. I should note, because the committee may find it relevant, that throughout those first 11 days, we saw almost no wildlife. This was not unusual in itself. The upper archipelago in autumn is not rich habitat, but I am a man trained to note what is present and what is absent in a given environment, and I recorded in my field log on the 8th day that I had observed no bird activity in the upper plateau area for 3 days. On the coast, we had seen gulls and some fulmar, but above the 300-meter elevation line, nothing. No tracks, no scat, no evidence of the Arctic fox activity that I would normally expect at that latitude in September. I noted it as an observation without drawing any conclusion from it. I mention it now because I want the committee to understand that the absence of certain things was noted before the presence of anything unusual was observed. The physical artifact that I have submitted to this committee, the segment of birch-handled survey rod bent at approximately 40 degrees through the midpoint shaft, was recovered on the 12th day of the expedition. I want to be precise about that, because subsequent events may make it seem as though the rod's condition was connected to what occurred later, and I want the committee to judge that connection for itself rather than have me present it as established fact. The rod in question was one of 4 we had carried up to the high shelf for use in the triangulation stations. Survey rods of this pattern are birch-handled and iron-shafted, approximately 180 centimeters in length, and designed to be planted in snow or soft soil to serve as sighting targets for the theodolite. They are not fragile instruments. The iron shaft is 3 centimeters in diameter, and the handles are turned hardwood, fitted at the upper and lower ends. To bend one at the midpoint would require the application of substantial lateral force, the kind that a man might produce by bracing the rod between 2 fixed points and applying body weight, or that a mechanical press might produce deliberately. It is not the kind of damage that results from being dropped, or from impact against rock during transport, or from any normal accident of field work. We found it on the morning of the 12th day, at the upper triangulation station, lying in the snow approximately 3 meters from where it had been planted the previous afternoon. Chesov found it first and brought it to my attention. He said nothing when he handed it to me, simply held it out and waited. I examined it for some time. I turned it in my hands and looked at the deformation carefully. The bend was clean, meaning the iron had not cracked or splintered. It had been flexed, and the flex was centered almost exactly at the midpoint of the shaft. There was no obvious point of impact, no mark on the snow where it might have been struck against something. I showed it to Sokolov, who examined it with equal care, and then said, in the measured way he had, that he was not sure what could have done that. I told the men that equipment did occasionally suffer damage under extreme cold, and that I would log it as cold stress failure. This was not an honest accounting, and Sokolov knew it, and I knew he knew it, but I said it because I did not have a better explanation, and I did not want to introduce uncertainty into the team at a point when uncertainty served no operational purpose. I kept the rod. I do not know, even now, exactly why I kept it. I had 4 rods. I needed only 3 for the remaining work. I should have left it there. Instead, I brought it back to the base camp and placed it along the inner wall of my tent, and it remained with me through everything that followed, and I carried it down from the high shelf when we descended, and I have had it in my lodgings in St. Petersburg for the past 4 months, and I am submitting it to this committee today, because I no longer wish it near me. That is the artifact. The committee has examined it. I will say nothing further about its physical properties, because the object speaks for itself. On the 13th day, Radko reported to me before breakfast that several of the supply stores had been disturbed overnight. Specifically, 2 of the waxed canvas provision bags that were stored outside the tents in the cold, as is standard practice to prevent thaw and refreeze cycling, had been moved from their original positions, and one had been partially opened. The contents were intact but scattered. Dried fish and hardtack, displaced in the snow around the bag. Radko showed me the scene with an expression I would describe as carefully neutral. He was clearly not certain what had happened, and was not ready to offer a theory. I looked at the snow around the bags for impressions. There were marks, but the wind had been active through the night, and the snow surface was disturbed enough that I could not read them cleanly. There was nothing I could positively identify as a footprint. I told Radko that it was possible an Arctic fox had come down from somewhere and investigated the bags, which were not especially well sealed, and that he should use the waxed line to secure them more firmly going forward. He accepted this explanation without comment. I want to be clear that I did not believe my own explanation when I gave it. I had noted the absence of fox activity for 5 days. What I believed, at that specific moment, was that I did not have sufficient information to justify alarm, and that speculative alarm in a field camp is corrosive. So I offered the most plausible natural explanation available, and I went about the day's survey work. That day was the 13th of September. I will come to what we found on the 16th day, which was when the nature of the situation became impossible to explain away. But I want to account for the time in between, because the committee's understanding of the escalation depends on it. The night of the 13th was the first night that I experienced what I subsequently came to understand as the primary indicator of proximity. I will describe it as precisely as I can. I was in my tent, in my sleeping bag, at approximately 2 in the morning. I was not asleep. I rarely sleep deeply in the field, and the combination of the wind noise and the cold makes full sleep difficult in any case. The temperature inside the tent was maintained by a small spirit lamp that I kept burning low, not for heat exactly, but because the lamp made the interior habitable in a way that darkness did not. The tent was, by my thermometer, approximately -4 Celsius inside, with the lamp burning. Cold but manageable. Over the course of perhaps 3 to 4 minutes, the temperature inside the tent dropped. I became aware of it first as a sensation on my face, which was the only part of me exposed above the sleeping bag. The cold intensified in a way that felt qualitatively different from normal radiative heat loss. It was not the gradual background cold that accumulates through a long night. It arrived. It pressed in from all sides simultaneously, the way cold water rises when you lower yourself into it. I pulled the sleeping bag higher across my chin and checked the lamp, which was burning normally. I breathed out slowly and watched my breath condense heavily in the lamplight, much more so than it had been an hour before. I checked my thermometer. -9 Celsius inside the tent. The temperature had dropped 5 degrees in the time it had taken me to sit up and check. I remained still for several minutes. The cold held at that level, perhaps intensifying slightly, and then, over the course of roughly 15 minutes, it eased back toward the previous level. I did not sleep for the remainder of that night. In the morning, I checked the external thermometer we had mounted on a pole outside the cook tent, and the overnight low had been -19 Celsius outside, consistent with the prior nights. Nothing externally unusual. I recorded the internal temperature drop in my field log as a notation without interpretation. Tent insulation variable, possible lamp performance issue. I noted the time as approximately 02:10 to 02:30. I did not speak to the other men about it that morning. On the 14th day, the survey proceeded on the upper plateau. We were working the northeastern triangulation stations, which required movement across exposed terrain between fixed sighting points, and the wind that day was severe enough to make instrument work difficult. We lost several hours to wind hold, and Sokolov's hands were badly chilled, despite his gloves, which concerned me enough that I had Brenner check them at the midday rest. They were fine, cold but not injured. Brenner told Sokolov to keep them closer to his body during the holds. On the afternoon of the 14th, Halvorsen came to me during a wind hold and said, without preamble, that he had seen something on the northern ridgeline the previous evening. He said it had been far enough away that he could not be certain of what he was looking at, but that it had been large and upright, and had not been there when he looked again 10 minutes later. He said he had decided not to mention it the night before, because he had not been certain, and he did not want to be responsible for what he described as unnecessary disturbance, but he thought I should know. I asked him how large. He was quiet for a moment, and then said he had no reliable reference point at that distance in the failing light, but that it had appeared to be substantially larger than a man. I asked whether he had considered the possibility that it was a trick of the light or a rock formation. He said that he had considered it, and that he did not think so. He said it had moved, a single shift of what appeared to be weight or position, and then been still, and then been absent. He said he would not have reported it at all if it had not moved. I thanked him. I told him to keep the observation between us for the present. He agreed without question, which told me that he had already decided this was the correct approach before he came to me with it. That night, the 14th, the temperature drop inside my tent recurred. This time I was awake when it began, and I had my watch in my hand. The drop was distinct and rapid, commencing at approximately 0:45 and reaching its lowest point, -11 Celsius inside the tent by my thermometer, within approximately 30 to 35 seconds of onset. 30 to 35 seconds, not a gradual shift, a precipitous one. My breath crystallized in a single exhalation midway through the sentence I was murmuring to myself, the end of a sentence I had begun before the cold arrived, and finished into an air that had changed between the first word and the last. The hair inside my nostrils frosted. I had not experienced this particular sensation before, and I want the committee to understand that it is unmistakable. It is not a normal feature of cold environments. It is a specific physical event. I held still for 17 minutes by the watch. The cold held. Then it began to ease, over roughly 10 minutes, back to the earlier level. I noted the duration in the log, 17 minutes of sustained anomalous cold. I did not sleep. On the morning of the 15th, I told Sokolov what Halvorsen had reported, and I told him about the temperature events in my tent. He listened with the pipe in his hand, unlit because the tobacco had been performing poorly in the cold, and he tapped the bowl against his knee twice, and then said that he believed me, and that he was not sure what it meant, and that he thought we should conduct a careful watch that night. He also told me something that I had not known, which was that Chesov had come to him the previous day with a similar report of a temperature event in his tent on the night of the 13th. Chesov had attributed it to a fault in his tent seam and had not brought it to me directly because he did not want to appear to be raising a complaint about the equipment. Sokolov had told him to keep it in mind and report again if it recurred. He had not told me until now, because he had shared Chesov's initial interpretation of a tent seam issue. So 3 of us had experienced it, on different nights, in different tents, positioned at different points within the camp perimeter. On the evening of the 15th, I arranged a watch rotation. I told the men that I wanted 2 people awake at any given time through the night, which I framed as a precaution against supply interference of the kind we had seen on the 13th. I did not say more than that. Sokolov took the first watch with Halvorsen. I took the second with Chesov. Brenner and Voss and Radko slept. Nothing occurred on the night of the 15th. No temperature event. No disturbance to the supplies. No sounds beyond the wind. I will not pretend this was reassuring. The absence of the thing I had been expecting felt more unsettling, not less, and I think Sokolov felt the same, though neither of us said so. The 16th was the day the committee is most interested in, and I will now account for it directly. The weather on the morning of the 16th was clear, which was unusual. We had had persistent overcast since the 5th day, and a clear sky at this latitude in September, with the sun at a shallow angle and the snow surface fully illuminated, produces a quality of light that is difficult to describe to someone who has not experienced it. Everything is visible at great distance, but the low angle and the reflection from the snow flatten depth in a way that makes it difficult to judge distance accurately. Objects at 500 meters can appear to be at 200. Relief features on the snow surface that would be obvious in diffuse overcast light become invisible in the flat glare. I want the committee to understand this, because it bears on the quality of what I observed and on how I calculated the measurements I recorded. We were on the upper plateau by mid-morning, completing the northeastern triangulation. The work was going well. The clear conditions were good for sighting, and we were making better progress than on any day since the weather had closed down. Voss was engaged in drafting the morning's data onto the working chart, which he always did in the field, rather than waiting for camp, and he was working with visible satisfaction. I remember watching him for a moment and thinking that the day felt like the kind of day that made the entire enterprise worth the difficulty. At approximately 11:30 in the morning, Halvorsen spoke my name. Just my name, nothing else, in a tone that was not alarmed but was not casual either. It was the tone a man uses when he has seen something and is not yet certain whether he is about to embarrass himself. I turned to where he was looking. On the northern ridgeline, at an estimated distance of 400 to 450 meters, a figure stood on the crest of the ridge. I want to be precise in my description. I will give the committee exactly what I observed, and no more than what I observed. The figure was upright, bipedal in stance, meaning it stood on two legs with the upper body elevated above a waist, or equivalent joint. The proportions were not human. The shoulder width was disproportionate to what I would expect at the apparent scale of the figure. The arms were long, hanging at the sides, reaching substantially below the midpoint of the body, which in a human being would place the hands at approximately hip level. These arms reached well past what would have been the upper thigh. The head was visible above the shoulder line and appeared large relative to the neck. But I want to be careful here, because the low-angle light and the distance made head and neck separation difficult to establish precisely. I used the sighting scope on the theodolite to examine the figure. This is a precision instrument, 6-power magnification, and it gave me a clearer view than the unaided eye. The figure's surface was covered in what appeared to be a pale, dense material. Not white the way snow is white, a different quality. Slightly irregular in texture, suggesting thickness or depth, the way heavy fur appears different from smooth hide at distance. The figure was not moving. It was simply standing on the ridgeline in the full, flat Arctic morning light, and it was looking, if I may use that word, in the direction of our camp. I took the theodolite sighting. I triangulated the figure's height using the known elevation of the ridgeline, which I had surveyed the previous day, and using standard angular measurement. The calculation I made in the field gave me a figure between 240 and 270 centimeters in height. That is 8 to 9 feet. I have reviewed my calculation 3 times since returning to St. Petersburg, and I find no error in it. Nobody in our party said anything for what I estimate was 2 full minutes. Then Voss said, quietly, "What is that?" It was not precisely a question. It was the statement of a man who has seen something for which he does not have a category. I told him I did not know. I told all of them to hold still and to not make any sudden movement or loud sound. They complied. We observed the figure for approximately 11 minutes. During that time, it did not move. I checked my thermometer twice during this period, both times noting that the external temperature was -21°C, consistent with the morning readings. I did not experience the anomalous cold during this observation. I want to be clear about that. The cold event I had been experiencing in the tent at night was not present during this morning sighting. I do not know what to make of this, and I will not speculate before the committee. After 11 minutes, the figure turned. I say turned, meaning the upper body rotated away from our direction, though the movement was minimal and contained, not a broad or sweeping motion. Then it descended from the ridgeline on the far side. I watched through the scope until it was no longer visible. It was gone in fewer steps than the distance and the slope should have required. I asked each member of the party to confirm what they had seen and to give me a size estimate. These are the estimates they gave. Sokolov said between 8 and 9 feet, consistent with my own. Halvorsen said very large, larger than any man. He would not give a precise number. Chesov said 6 or 7 feet, which I believe reflects the difficulty of judging size at distance without an adequate reference point, rather than genuine disagreement with the other estimates. Brenner said that his initial estimate was between 250 and 280 centimeters. Voss said he had not been looking at it when it first appeared, but had watched it for perhaps 8 or 9 of the 11 minutes, and that he estimated its height at approximately 9 feet. Radko had been at the cook station below the plateau level and had not seen it. I recorded all of this in the field log immediately. I did not know then that this was the last time all 7 of us would be together on that ridgeline. That thought did not occur to me until the morning of the 17th, when the structure of our situation had changed in ways I had not anticipated, and by then the count had already begun to matter. We returned to base camp that afternoon. I will not pretend that the descent was orderly in spirit, though it was orderly in practice. The men moved with purpose. Nobody spoke much on the descent. Radko had a meal ready, and the normality of it, the hot metal smell of the pot, and the warmth of the cook tent, had a steadying effect that I was grateful for. We ate. I let the men talk around the meal, because the silence was more dangerous than any conversation, and they needed to discharge what they had seen through speech before it calcified into something harder. Chesov was of the opinion that what we had seen was explainable if we assumed it was a very large bear, a polar bear standing on its hind legs, which can reach considerable heights. I told him that I had used the sighting scope and that the proportions were not consistent with a bear on its hind legs, specifically that the shoulder structure and the arm configuration were not plantigrade. He acknowledged this, but said that his preference was to hold the bear hypothesis until it was definitively ruled out. Halvorsen said nothing during the meal discussion. He ate steadily and kept his hands occupied and looked at the table rather than at any of the others. I had come to understand that this was Halvorsen's mode when he was thinking carefully, and I did not press him. Voss said that regardless of what it was, it had not approached, and that it had left, and that our scientific obligation was to continue the survey and to record the sighting as an unidentified natural phenomena, pending further observation. He said this with complete sincerity. He genuinely believed it. He was 24 years old, and he had done everything right up to that point, and he had a philosophy of documentation that I had respected 3 weeks earlier, and that now, in context, produced in me a quiet, cold feeling that had nothing to do with the temperature. Sokolov watched Voss during this speech, and then looked at me, and I understood from his expression exactly what he was thinking, because I was thinking it too. Brenner asked me, clinically, whether I thought the situation warranted beginning an orderly withdrawal. He framed it as a medical question, framing physical and psychological risk. I told him that I was going to assess overnight and make a recommendation to the group in the morning. He accepted this. After the meal, I took Sokolov aside. I told him that I was going to recommend descent to the coastal depot the following morning. Not full withdrawal from the expedition, but a move to the lower position where we had more terrain buffer and better access to the ship's eventual return route. He said he thought that was correct. He said the rod bothered him more than the sighting. I asked what he meant. He said that the rod had been up there the night before we saw anything. that whatever bent it had been up there before we had observed it, and that this suggested a timeline of proximity that preceded our awareness of the situation, possibly by several days. I had been thinking the same thing. That night, the 16th, the temperature event returned. It was the most severe I had yet recorded. The drop began at approximately 0035 and was steep enough that by the time I had my watch in hand and was actively counting, the thermometer inside the tent read -14. The hairs in my nostrils frosted in one exhalation. My breath did not dissipate inside the tent but hung, crystallizing immediately in the lamplight into a small, hovering cloud that did not disperse. I held my tin cup of water, which I keep beside my bedroll for night waking, and I watched the surface of the water form a film of ice across the top while I was holding the cup in my bare hand. The cup was metal. My hand was warm. I watched the film form on the water surface and then thicken into a solid skin within perhaps 20 seconds. My hand transferred no heat to the air inside the cup, fast enough to prevent it. The temperature then was -14 inside the tent, with a lamp burning. Outside, by calculation against the prior day's outdoor readings, it was somewhere near -25. I did not check outside. I lay still, holding the frozen cup, and I breathed as shallowly as I could manage, and I counted by pocket watch. The cold held at that level for 23 minutes. Then it eased, slower than before on the return. The ice skin on the cup softened, but did not fully melt before I put it down. I was awake for the rest of the night. In the morning, I announced to the full party my recommendation to descend to the coastal depot. I explained that the environmental conditions on the upper shelf were deteriorating faster than projected, and that completing the final northeastern stations from the lower position was operationally feasible if we used longer sighting runs. This was not entirely fabricated. The cold was genuinely severe, and the rationale was defensible on survey grounds. Voss objected. He was polite about it, which made it worse. He said that we were 3 days from completing the upper plateau work, and that a move to the lower position would require us to redo the triangulation geometry from scratch, which would add at least a week to the schedule and likely push us beyond the ship's return window, meaning we would have to leave incomplete work behind. He said that the Society had contracted for the upper triangulation specifically, and that it was his professional view that we were obligated to complete it. He said all of this quietly, with the precision of a man who has rehearsed the argument, and then he looked at me and waited. I told him that my authority as expedition lead included operational risk assessment, and that I had made the assessment. He asked me what specific operational risk I was citing. I looked at him for a moment. Then I told him that the sighting of the previous morning represented an unquantified risk factor, and that my responsibility to the safety of the party exceeded my responsibility to the schedule. He said, with genuine and respectful disagreement, we observed something at 400 meters that did not approach us and departed without incident. I do not think that is a grounds for withdrawal. Sokolov told him that this was the expedition lead's decision to make. Voss acknowledged this and said that he would comply, but that he wanted his objection noted in the record. I told him it was noted. I meant to note it in the field log, and I believe I did, though the log was not among the materials I brought down from the high shelf in full, as the committee is aware. We began packing on the morning of the 17th. The packing of an Arctic field camp is not fast work. Instrument crates must be repacked with the same care that they arrived in, because a damaged theodolite on a return transit has cost more than one expedition its data. Tent poles must be bundled in a specific sequence, or they bind in the cold. Provision sledges must be relashed against movement on the slope. We worked through the morning and into the early afternoon, and by 3 in the afternoon, I judged us approximately 2 hours from being ready to begin the descent. At roughly 3:30, Halvorsen came to me from the northern edge of the camp perimeter. He had been conducting a final check of the upper station markers, which I had asked him to do so that I could note their positions accurately in the log before we left them. He came back to me without the notes I had expected, and he said, in the measured way he had, that there were new tracks on the upper shelf. I went with him. The tracks were in the snow between the camp perimeter and the base of the northern ridgeline. They were approximately 120 meters from the edge of the camp. I want to describe them carefully. They were bipedal. Each impression was roughly 50 to 55 centimeters in length, which I measured using the calibrated measuring tape I carry for site work. They were deep, deeper than I would have expected from surface snow alone, suggesting either very great weight or a snow surface that had softened in the previous day's slightly warmer midday temperature and then refrozen hard in the night. The stride length, measured between the center of one impression and the center of the next, was approximately 210 centimeters. That is the stride, not the step, both feet, but the single step distance, 1 foot to the other. For reference, my own stride in snow, walking deliberately, is approximately 90 centimeters. The tracks came from the north and terminated at a point approximately 120 meters from the camp perimeter. They did not circle the camp. They did not approach at an angle. They came from the north in a line that pointed directly at the center of the camp. And they stopped, and they did not go back. There were no tracks leading away. I stood there with Halverson, and we both looked at the place where the tracks ended, and there was nothing either of us found to say about this. The snow surface beyond the final track impression was undisturbed, not windswept, not drifted, simply clean and unbroken, as though something of very great weight had reached that point and then ceased to exist. I am not saying it ceased to exist. I am saying that the snow gave me no information about where it went after that point, and the wind had not been active enough in the previous 18 hours to account for the erasure of tracks of that depth. Halverson said, very quietly, "We should tell the others." I said yes. We told them. Chesov asked to see the tracks, and I took him out. He counted the impressions carefully and measured one alongside my measurement, getting a consistent result, and then stood up and said nothing further. Sokolov did not ask to see them. Brenner asked if I had taken sketch measurements for the record, and I told him I had, and that I would add them to the log. Voss went out to see them himself, without asking, and came back and said that the absence of return tracks was explicable if the figure had retraced its own footprints precisely on the way back, which would be very difficult, but not impossible. No one agreed with him. Not even he seemed fully committed to the argument. I made the decision, at that point, that we would begin the descent that evening, rather than the following morning. We were close enough to ready that the additional 2 hours of packing could be completed in the morning light, but I did not want another night on the high shelf. I told the men we would move at first light. That night was the 17th. I organized the watch with care. Sokolov and Halverson on first watch, outside the tents, with instructions to wake me immediately for any development. I and Chesov would take the second watch. The instructions were clear. No confrontation, no loud noise, no lights beyond what was necessary for safe movement. If anything was observed, wake me. I lay down in my sleeping bag fully dressed, with my boots on, and I did not expect to sleep. At approximately 01:10, Sokolov woke me. He did not shake me or call out. He put his hand on my shoulder, firmly, once, and when I opened my eyes he held a finger to his lips and gestured toward the tent entrance. I followed him out. The cold was immediate and severe when I emerged from the tent. The outside air hit my face at what I estimated was -22 or 23 Celsius, consistent with the preceding nights. There was no wind. The sky was clear, and the moon was at perhaps 3/4, and the snow surface was fully illuminated in the flat silver light of a cloudless Arctic night. I could see the camp perimeter clearly. I could see the ridgeline. Sokolov pointed to the southern end of the ridgeline, at the point where the ridge curved to meet the plateau edge before descending. Halverson was standing 10 meters away, very still, looking in the same direction. The figure was on the ridgeline, not at the same point it had occupied during the morning sighting 2 days prior. This position was lower on the ridge, closer to the plateau edge, and therefore closer to the camp. My immediate instinct was to estimate the distance, which I did, at approximately 250 to 280 meters, substantially closer than the 400 meters of the morning sighting. It was standing in the same posture I had observed through the scope, upright, arms hanging, the disproportionate width of the shoulders clear even in the moonlight. At 280 meters in clear moonlight, I did not need the scope to see the fundamental proportions. It was very large. It was motionless. It was looking in our direction, or its head orientation was in our direction, which I cannot translate with certainty into the claim of looking, but which I will describe as such, because I do not have a better word. And then I felt it. The cold arrived. Not the outside cold. The outside cold was already present, and I was already inside it. What arrived was something different. It came from no direction in particular. It was simply there, suddenly, pressing through my coat and into my skin, and deeper than that. My breath, which had been condensing normally in the outside air since I emerged from the tent, changed. The condensation became immediate and heavy, the exhaled air not dispersing but freezing in a visible mass in front of my face before I had finished the breath. The hair inside my nostrils frosted in that single breath. My eyelashes, which had been slightly damp from sleep, felt as though they had stiffened. I checked my watch. I counted. The cold maintained that sudden, pressed quality for approximately 30 to 35 seconds, and then the figure on the ridgeline began to move. I am going to describe this movement accurately, even knowing that the description is difficult to credit. The figure descended from the ridgeline and crossed the distance to the edge of the camp in what I can only describe as very few strides. I do not mean few in the sense of a running human covering ground rapidly. I mean few in the sense that the strides themselves were of a scale that I am not able to account for against the distance covered. I have walked that slope. I surveyed it. The distance from the ridgeline to the camp perimeter at the point the figure descended was, by my prior measurement, approximately 260 meters over terrain that included a slope of 15 to 18 degrees. I counted 9 strides from the point the figure left the ridgeline to the point it stopped. 9 strides across 260 meters of inclined snow. I want the committee to understand that I have not adjusted this count. I counted in the moment, with my watch in my hand, and I recorded 9. I cannot explain what that means in terms of stride length or locomotion mechanics, and I am not going to pretend that I can. The figure stopped at approximately 30 meters from the edge of the camp. 30 meters, the width of a large city street. In the moonlight, and at that distance it was entirely visible. I could see the texture of the pale covering material. I could see the displacement of its weight from one foot to the other. A minimal shift, not movement exactly, but the kind of micro-adjustment that a standing creature makes when it is breathing, when it is balancing, when it is present in its body. The arms were at its sides. The head was oriented toward us. At 30 meters, in clear moonlight, I can tell the committee with certainty that what was standing at the edge of our camp was not a bear. It was not any animal in my experience of northern fauna. It was bipedal, it was enormous, and it was standing there with the quality of deliberateness, of purposeful stillness, that I associate not with animal behavior, but with the behavior of a being that is making a decision. Sokolov was beside me. Halvorsen was to my left. None of the 3 of us moved. I am not certain that any of us were capable of moving in that specific moment. The figure remained at that position for 11 minutes. I timed it. 11 minutes, by pocket watch. It did not advance. It did not make a sound. It did not produce visible breath condensation in the negative 22-degree air, which I want the committee to note is its own separate impossibility. At that temperature, a human being's breath vapor is visible from 30 meters in moonlight. I could see Sokolov's breath to my left. I could see Halvorsen's breath. I saw nothing from the figure. During those 11 minutes, the anomalous cold held at what I estimated was the severe end of what I had been experiencing in the tent. Not the moderate onset I had felt at first contact. The cold at this proximity was the deepest I experienced across the entire encounter. My coat, which is a good coat, felt insufficient. My hands, inside double gloves, ached. I was standing still in negative 22 Celsius air, and I was colder than I should have been, more profoundly cold, in a way that went past the numbers. Then the other tent flap opened, and Voss came out. He had been awake, I learned later, and had heard or felt something that brought him to the tent entrance, and he had looked out and seen what we were looking at, and then, rather than staying inside, he had come out. He came out and stood beside me and looked at the figure at the edge of the camp and said nothing. I put my hand on his arm and indicated that he should be still. He was still. We stood there, 4 of us, for the remaining minutes of that 11-minute span. Then Brenner came out of his tent, then Chesov, then Radko. All 7 of us stood in the moonlit camp at 3 in the morning, in the Arctic cold, and looked at the thing standing 30 meters from us, and it looked at us, or oriented itself toward us, and none of us made a sound. When the 11 minutes had elapsed, the figure turned, not away exactly. More precisely, it shifted its weight and orientation in a way that suggested it was through with what it had been doing. There was something in the shift that I can only describe as the movement of something that had reached a conclusion. Then it moved back, away from the camp, in the direction of the ridgeline. It moved at the same impossible economy of stride. I did not count this time. I watched. In the time it took me to draw a breath and release it, it had covered the ground to the base of the ridge. In the time it took me to draw another, it was at the ridge crest. And then it was gone, over the far side, and the ridgeline was empty against the moonlit sky. Nobody spoke for what felt like a very long time. Then I said, as clearly and calmly as I could manage, "We are leaving before first light. Everyone pack what you need to carry. Leave what you cannot manage. We go down at 4. There was a brief silence, and then there was general movement, controlled, purposeful, the sound of men who are frightened, but who have been given direction. Voss did not move. I looked at him. He was still looking at the ridgeline. "Orlov," he said, "we do not know that it is dangerous." I told him that I was not interested in a debate about what constituted danger. "The survey is not complete," he said. 3 days. 3 more days and we have everything the society contracted for. The society will want to know why we abandoned a complete survey 3 days from its finish." Sokolov said, with a sharpness I had not heard from him before, that the society would understand once I submitted my report. Voss turned to look at me directly. His expression was not panicked, and it was not defiant. It was the expression of a young man who had decided on a principle and who was trying to make the case for it as honestly as he knew how. That is what makes it impossible to describe without it costing me something to do so. He said, "I will stay and complete the northeastern stations. I will work alone if necessary, and I will finish the section and descend with a complete data set. The society hired me to do this work." I told him that I was not going to leave him on the upper shelf alone. He said that he was not asking my permission. He was stating what he was going to do. I looked at him for a long moment. Then I looked at the ridgeline, then back at him. "Voss," I said, "whatever that was, it came close enough tonight to count us. I believe it came down here to do exactly that." He said nothing. I told the group that we were departing at 4 and that I expected every man to be ready. I did not say anything further to Voss. The packing resumed. I worked. Sokolov worked. Halvorsen, Chesov, Radko, Brenner, all of them worked. Voss stood at the edge of the camp for perhaps 10 minutes more, looking at the ridgeline, and then went into his tent. I did not look at his tent again until we were ready to move. At 10 minutes to 4, Sokolov came to me and said that Voss had not packed. I went to his tent and opened the flap. His sleeping bag was rolled. His personal bag was closed. His instrument case was latched. He was dressed and ready. He looked at me from inside the tent with an expression that I did not know how to read. I told him to bring his kit and join the group. He said, "I will follow you down by tomorrow evening. The weather is clear. I know the route. I will finish the northeastern stations and be at the coastal depot by the following morning." I told him this was not acceptable. He said carefully that he was not asking me to accept it. He said that when he came down with the completed survey data, the expedition's record would be intact, and that he believed the situation on the upper shelf was not what I thought it was, and that he was willing to accept the personal risk involved in remaining. Standing there in the opening of his tent in the freezing pre-dawn, I understood that I had reached the point where my authority meant nothing. I could not carry him down the mountain. I could not physically compel a grown man who had made a decision, and every minute we stood arguing was a minute we were still on the high shelf in the dark, after what had just spent 11 minutes standing 30 meters from our camp perimeter. One other man, the committee has the name in my formal report, and I will confirm it as Pyotr Chesov, had slowed his packing and was watching the tent opening with an expression that told me he was considering staying as well. Whether out of loyalty to Voss or out of a different kind of stubbornness, I could not determine in the moment. I made the decision. I told Voss to be at the coastal depot by morning of the 19th. I told him the emergency signal routine. I told him that if he was not there by 0600 on the 19th, I would have no choice but to report him as missing and to instruct the ship to make contact with the coastal relay station. He said he understood and that he would be there. Chesov, seeing that Voss was remaining, appeared to consider it further, and then Halvorsen said something to him quietly that I did not hear, and Chesov gathered his pack and joined the rest of us. We left at 4 in the morning. The descent in darkness was not easy. The slope was icy in the pre-dawn cold, and we were moving faster than was ideal for the terrain, because I wanted distance between us and the upper shelf before the light came. Sokolov's bad knee made the descent painful for him, and I stayed close on his downhill side for the steeper sections. We did not speak much. The mountain was very quiet, no wind, the kind of silence that, in other circumstances, I would describe as peaceful. I will tell the committee what I noticed during the descent, because I want the record to be complete. The anomalous cold, the pressing, surrounding cold that was distinct from the ambient temperature, the cold that frosted breath mid-sentence, did not occur during the descent. Not once. We descended from the high shelf to the mid-elevation route in approximately 2 hours, and the cold was simply the cold of the Arctic at 4 in the morning, severe and consistent and explicable. Whatever had been accompanying that cold had not followed us down. I do not know what to make of that. We reached the coastal base depot, which was a cache position we had established on the first day from the ship, at approximately 8:30 in the morning. The coastal position was lower and more sheltered, and the temperature there was noticeably more moderate, around -14, which after the upper shelf felt almost warm. Radko had a fire going within 20 minutes. We ate and we waited, and nobody talked about what we had left behind. Brenner came to me that evening and asked whether I thought Voss was safe. I told him I did not know. He said that he wanted to be certain I was aware that Voss had been showing signs of what he called unusual fixity of purpose over the previous several days, meaning a narrowing of attention and an unwillingness to accept situational reassessment that Brenner had been watching with professional concern. He said this carefully, as he said everything, and I understood that he was telling me that something had been wrong with Voss before the final night, and that my decision to let him stay might have been made against a man who was not in a fully sound state of mind. This is information I have carried since that morning, and I will carry it for the rest of my life. We waited at the depot. The 19th came. Voss did not appear by 0600. He did not appear by noon. He did not appear by evening. I initiated the emergency signal routine, and the coastal relay station was contacted, and the sequence of communications that followed is in the administrative record the committee already holds, and I will not repeat it here in full. A search party was organized and made the ascent in early April of the following spring, once the worst of the winter had passed and the upper shelf was accessible again. They found Alexei Voss at the upper triangulation station, at the northeastern end of the plateau, seated with his back against the rock cairn that marks that station's position. He was upright. He was facing north. He was frozen, and had been for months. He showed no injury, no evidence of violence, no evidence of exposure collapse in the typical pattern, meaning he had not been found curled or huddled, as a hypothermia victim typically is found. He was seated upright, facing north, as though he had sat down to rest and had not gotten back up. His instrument case was open beside him. His charts were in it, and the committee will have been informed that the northeastern triangulation data was complete and accurate in every measured station. He had finished the work. The committee asked me, in pre-deposition correspondence, whether I believe Voss completed the survey stations before he died, or whether he was prevented from descending. I have thought about this carefully. My answer is that I do not know, and that the two possibilities are not necessarily separate. What I believe, and I want to be careful to flag this as belief rather than testimony, is that Voss remained on that shelf because something in him had decided to remain. Whether that decision was fully his own, I cannot say. Brenner's assessment of his mental state in the final days before the descent is relevant here, and the committee should weigh it. The body was recovered, and the survey data was delivered to the society. The northeastern triangulation is now complete. I am told it is being incorporated into the 1898 boundary maps. Alexei Voss's name will appear in the expedition record, in the data compilation, and I hope in some formal acknowledgement from the society, because the data he collected is accurate, and he collected it under circumstances that I cannot adequately describe to people who were not there. Now I will address the committee's specific questions regarding what I believe the entity we observed was, and whether I believe it was responsible for Voss's death. On the first question, I do not know what it was. I can tell the committee what it was not. It was not a polar bear or any other species in my catalogue of northern fauna. It was not a human being at any scale of normal human physiological variation. It was not a trick of light or distance, because I measured it with a precision instrument from a known baseline at a known elevation differential. It was not a shared delusion, because 7 separate observers saw it on 2 occasions and gave descriptions that, while variable in the precision of measurement, were consistent in the fundamental facts of what was observed. What it was, in the positive sense, I am not able to say. I have heard, since my return, references to old indigenous accounts from the northern regions describing large, white, upright walking beings associated with the deep cold of the high Arctic. I was not aware of these accounts when I was in the field, and they did not influence my observations. I present them only as context the committee may find useful in its consideration. On the second question, whether the entity was responsible for Voss's death, I can testify only to what I observed. I observed the entity standing at the edge of our camp. I observed it depart when it chose to depart. I observed Voss choose to remain when the rest of us descended. I observed the state in which Voss was found, upright and uninjured and frozen, seated facing north. Whether the entity did something to Voss directly, or whether its proximity affected his decision-making in some way, I cannot define, or whether Voss simply made a decision that killed him with no influence beyond his own conviction, I cannot say from the evidence available to me. What I can say is this: I left him there. I made the decision to go, and I knew when I made it that there was a risk I could not quantify. And I made it anyway because I had 5 other men in my care, and because the alternative was arguing until the dawn with a 24-year-old cartographer who had convinced himself that documentation was more important than whatever was standing on that ridgeline. I do not believe I made the wrong decision. I believe it was the decision that saved 5 lives. I also believe it was the decision that cost 1, and those 2 beliefs coexist without resolving into something comfortable, and I expect they will continue to coexist for as long as I am alive. I would like to speak for a moment about the bent survey rod, which I have submitted as physical evidence. I have described how it was found and when. I have given the committee my testimony about its physical condition, which the committee has now examined directly and can assess for itself. What I have not yet said, and what I believe belongs in the complete record, is what the rod's condition means in terms of the timeline. We found the rod on the 12th day of the expedition. We observed the entity for the first time on the 16th. The temperature events in the tents began on the 13th night. The supply disturbance was on the 13th morning. The rod was bent before any of these events. Something had been on that high shelf, had been present at our survey station, close enough to pick up a survey rod and apply the kind of force necessary to bend an iron shaft, before we were aware of any of it, before we had seen anything. before the cold events in the tents, before the supply disturbance. It was there, in our equipment, on our survey station, before we had any indication that anything was wrong. I do not know what this means in terms of the entity's intent. I have considered several possibilities. That it was examining our instruments out of curiosity, in the way an intelligent being examines objects it does not recognize. That it was demonstrating something, leaving evidence of its presence and capability for us to find. That the bending of the rod was incidental, a result of how it was handled rather than a deliberate act. I cannot determine which of these is true, and I will not pretend otherwise. What I know is that the rod was bent from both ends simultaneously, by a force applied at the midpoint, in a way that requires leverage and deliberate effort, not accident, and it was left where we would find it. I have submitted the rod because I want it out of my possession. I want the committee to hold it, to log it, to put it in whatever storage they use for expedition materials, because I am done being in the same room as it. This is not a rational position, and I am not claiming it is rational. I am simply telling the committee what I need from them regarding the artifact, and I leave the rest to their discretion. I want now to address the temperature events in detail, because I believe they constitute the most significant evidentiary element of my testimony, and because I want to be precise about what I am claiming. I am claiming that on 5 separate occasions across the nights of the 13th through the 17th, I experienced a localized drop in air temperature inside a closed tent, with a spirit lamp burning, that exceeded 5 degrees Celsius from baseline in under 1 minute, and that on 3 of those occasions exceeded 10 degrees from baseline. I am claiming that this temperature drop was accompanied by immediate and unusual crystallization of breath condensation, by the frosting of nasal hair within a single exhalation, and on the 17th, the final night before our descent, by the freezing of surface water in a metal cup held in a warm hand. I am claiming that these temperature events preceded each sighting or indication of proximity by what I estimated at between 20 and 40 seconds, based on my timing of the 17th night's event, in direct comparison to the moment the figure became visible on the ridgeline. I am claiming that on the approach to camp on the night of the 17th, when the figure descended from the ridge and stopped at 30 meters from the perimeter, the anomalous cold was present in the open air outside the tents, not merely inside them, and that it was more severe than any previous instance, consistent with an increase in proximity. I am claiming that on the descent from the high shelf, the anomalous cold was entirely absent, not reduced, absent. I am not claiming to know what caused these temperature events. I am claiming that they occurred, that they were observed by multiple members of the party, that they correlated directly with proximity to the entity, and that they are, to my knowledge, inconsistent with any natural meteorological or thermodynamic explanation I am able to identify. The committee may do with this testimony what it judges appropriate. I have one final matter to address before I yield to the committee's questions. In the pre-deposition correspondence I received from the committee, one letter contained a question I want to answer directly, because I believe it is the question behind every other question in this proceeding. The letter asked whether, in my professional assessment, the entity we observed posed a threat to the expedition. I think about the survey rod bent at the midpoint, the cold that arrived before the entity did, the figure that descended 260 meters of inclined snow in 9 strides and stood 30 meters from 7 sleeping men for 11 minutes and then left. I think about Alexei Voss, seated upright against the cairn, facing north, finished. I think about the fact that it let 5 of us leave. I think about that carefully, because it is the question I cannot stop returning to. Whether it let us leave because we were leaving without what it had wanted returned, meaning we were going empty-handed from a place we had intruded into. Whether it stopped at the camp perimeter because the perimeter itself was a boundary it had decided to observe, for reasons of its own. Whether it was counting us, as I testified I believed, and whether its count on the 17th night had told it something that determined its actions, I do not know. I know that Voss stayed and did not come down. I know that the rest of us went and did come down. I know that whatever had been watching us from the ridgeline, bending our instruments, cooling our tents, approaching our camp in strides that should not have been possible, was still there when we left. It did not pursue us. It did not follow us to the coast. It remained on the high shelf, in the deep cold of the Arctic autumn, and for all I know, it is there still. In my professional assessment, the entity posed a threat that I was not able to quantify, that appeared to be purposeful rather than incidental, and that resolved only when we removed ourselves from the territory we had entered. Whether removal was the condition it required, or whether Voss was the price it was willing to accept in lieu of full removal, I cannot say. What I can say, and what I want entered into the record clearly and without qualification, is that I believe the northern high shelf of the Novaya Zemlya upper archipelago contains something that has been there longer than any of us have been mapping it, and that it is aware of the difference between its territory and ours, and that the cost of ignoring that difference is something that I have already seen itemized. I am done. I will take the committee's questions. End of deponent's direct statement. Committee questions follow in attached continuation, to be filed separately per administrative procedure. Notation appended by Secretary I. Lashkov. 14 March 1898. Witness demeanor. Composed. Account internally consistent. Matter referred to no further inquiry. The bent survey rod described in testimony has been logged as Expedition Equipment Item 7, Northern Survey Novaya Zemlya 1897, and transferred to Society Storage, Basement Archive, Cabinet 9. It has not been catalogued for public exhibition. I have written this additional paragraph outside the formal deposition record, and I am placing it in the file myself, because there is something that belongs in the account, and that I could not say cleanly in testimony, without the committee deciding I was no longer in a reliable state of mind. On the night of the 17th, standing in the moonlight with the thing 30 meters from us, I thought about what Voss had said, that we did not know it was dangerous. I thought about it standing there without breathing, without producing breath vapor in negative 22-degree air, looking at us with whatever it used to look. I thought about 9 strides across 260 meters of Arctic slope. I thought about the rod, bent clean at the midpoint, left where we would find it. And I thought, it knows we mapped it. It knows we measured it. I pointed an instrument at it and triangulated its height and wrote the number down. I do not know if that matters. I do not know if something that can cross a slope in 9 strides and cool the air inside a sealed tent from the outside is troubled by being measured. But I have not stopped wondering whether the bent rod was a message, and whether the message was, I know what your instruments are for. And I have not stopped wondering whether Voss, sitting against the cairn with his chart case open and his data complete, and his face turned north into whatever had come for him, whether Voss understood at the end what he had stayed to document. I carry the survey data he completed. It is clean and accurate, and it will appear in the Society's boundary maps for the Northern Archipelago for as long as the maps are used. His name will be in the compilation acknowledgement. It is the only thing I know how to give him, and it is not enough. The rod is in the cabinet now. I have been told which cabinet. I know where it is. I will not go back to the archipelago. But I think about the high shelf more than I have told anyone. I think about what it would mean to know, definitively, what we encountered. And then I stop thinking about it, because I know what that kind of thinking cost the last man I left behind, and because I know that the cost of knowing is something you pay in advance, on the way up, before you understand the currency. Voss was not wrong that the world is not yet fully known. He was wrong about what kind of knowledge the unknown owes us. Pavel Dmitrievich Orlov, St. Petersburg, 14 March 1898.